Greetings, folks, and welcome. This is the final video that covers material from my book, The Pursuit of Economic Development. So I thought it would be fun to end with a list. That's because everybody loves lists. I was debating between a top 10 list, like David Letterman used to have on his show, or a top 40 list, like the American Top 40, that counts down the top songs of the week. But instead, I came up with a list of the 25 principles of economic development. And I should note that this list of 25 principles of economic development comes from the fact that the book covered 7 approaches and strategies for the growth of good jobs, and for each approach, I suggested 3 principles. So 7 times 3 is 21. And then, at the end of the book, I added another 4 principles, which makes 25 in total. Also, just as a preview, I'm not going to spend a lot of time in this video on any particular principle. The reason for this is that most of what I'm going to talk about has been covered in a different video, and if all else fails, you can learn more about it by reading the book. So let's jump in with the first 2 principles of economic development, which we covered in our earlier look at the effects of business costs in a region on the growth of good jobs. One of the main findings of that analysis is that having low costs of doing business helps the growth of regions in terms of the employment index that we studied, but it does not positively affect a region's productivity and the growth of good jobs. A second important finding from our look at business costs is that taxes are one of many costs faced by businesses. For example, businesses also have labor costs, utilities, cost of capital and technology, and a wide range of other costs. And we also found that other regional characteristics, things like the industries present in a region and even its climate, are more important to the pursuit of economic development. The third principle, related to the cost of doing business in a region, is actually more of a suggestion that elected officials and economic development professionals should take a balanced approach when discussing taxes, wages, and other costs of doing business. For the fourth principle of economic development, we move into our look at industry clusters and the effect of industry specialization on the growth of good jobs. And given that we certainly found that a region's industry mix affects economic development, it's important to pay attention to the industries present in a region, as well as their recent growth and prospects for the future. Principles 5 and 6 also deal with the industries present in a region, and Principle 5 highlights the importance of keeping track of a region's position in the global economy, and to develop strategies to take advantage of the opportunities related to international and even domestic competition. Principle 6 of economic development reminds us that it's important to have a balanced and realistic view about the future of existing manufacturing businesses in a region, as well as the prospects for attracting new manufacturing plants. This principle is backed by analysis that found the growth of manufacturing in a region contributes to economic development, but that places that specialized in manufacturing way back in 1990 did not fare particularly well for economic development moving forward. The next 3 principles focus on human capital, and of these 3, the most important advice to a region is to encourage the acquisition of human capital. This includes education, skills, experience, and knowledge that can be used in the workforce. We found that human capital is good for individuals in terms of their wages, and it helps the productivity of regions. Principle 8 reminds us, however, that the effects of human capital on economic development differ between states and U.S. metropolitan areas, and even across different size metros. And the common theme found several places in the book is that human capital is especially important to large metropolitan areas. Given the importance of education and skills to economic development, Principle 9 encourages regions to come up with a skills and occupational-based cluster strategy to complement their industry clusters. The next 3 principles deal with business size, and the first of these suggests that regions should focus their efforts around helping small businesses grow into larger companies. And I should point out that this is different than attempting to increase the number of small businesses that are located in a region. When dealing with small businesses, local officials need to recognize the differences in motivations across small business owners about why they're in operation and if they even want to grow and expand. That's because some, or even most, small businesses are happy being small. The third principle related to business size, and this is Principle 12, deals with large businesses. And it's a reminder of the ups and downs of having large businesses in a region. First off, a large business created a lot of jobs in the past that contributed to a region's growth. And large businesses often pay higher wages too. So it's safe to say that, like an old sports car, a large business provided lots of thrills in the past. But also, like a vintage sports car, it's often difficult to keep a large business at its peak performance. Large businesses often face competition from smaller and more nimble companies, so just like an older sports car, it's hard for a large business to stay ahead in a race. The next few principles are related to technology, and Principle 13 reminds us that technology, in all of its forms, helps the economic development of U.S. metropolitan areas. And you might recall that we looked at high technology, biotechnology, and even environmental and energy technology. The next principle suggests that technology contributes to income and employment growth, which suggests that it's leading to a divergence of the fortunes of U.S. regions. By divergence, we mean that the regions that started ahead of the pack actually experienced more growth and development than other regions. This is different than a process of convergence in which lagging regions are able to catch up to others. A final note about technology, and this is the basis for Principle 15, is that the impacts of technology are more pronounced in larger metropolitan areas. The next three principles of economic development, which are Principles 16, 17, and 18, focus on amenities. The first thing to remember about amenities is that they impact regions primarily through employment growth. In other words, amenities do not typically have a positive impact on incomes in a region. Principle 17 reminds us that pleasant weather is the most desirable amenity of all. And there's an interesting quote that we talked about earlier that underscores the importance of weather to the growth of regions. What makes the quote so impactful is that the statement is actually in the context of the impacts of human capital, that is, education, on the growth of cities. When discussing the prime importance of education to urban growth, Edward Glaser wrote, "Education is, after January temperature, the most reliable predictor of urban growth, especially among older cities." In other words, January climate has a very large impact on the growth of cities. The third principle related to amenities is that despite the fact that we didn't find large impacts of amenities on the overall economic development of regions, people place a very high value on living near and around amenities. This is because people actually pay to be around amenities through a combination of paying higher housing costs or accepting lower wages. And because people are willing to pay to be around amenities, we're less apt to find positive impacts of amenities on wages. In Principles 19, 20, and 21, we move to our study of the impacts of what I call the newness of regions on economic development. And an important result from this analysis is that there's a difference between the impacts of young things that mature with age and a constant influx of new things. You might recall that we found regions with younger populations as of 1990 performed considerably better for economic development in the decades that followed. When we looked at the impacts of newcomers on economic development, however, the impacts were primarily on growth, but not on the productivity of regions. Principle 20 reminds us about the impacts of patents on economic development, and here we found that patents impacted the productivity of large U.S. metropolitan areas, but not their growth. Likewise, we did not find statistically significant impacts of patents on the economic development of small U.S. metros or states. The third and final principle related to the newness of regions is the suggestion that elected officials and economic development professionals should consider the age of a region, and here I mean the demographics of the population and the age of things like the housing stock, when implementing plans and policies. And now, starting with Principle 22, we are down to the final four that cut across the entire book. The first cross-cutting theme, and we found this over and over throughout the book, is that the factors important to economic development, differ between states and metropolitan areas, and even among different sized metros. Principle 23 reminds us, and this also came up over and over throughout the book, that growth and economic development are not the same. We used an employment index, which measured the percentage change in employment over time, as well as unemployment rates, to represent the growth of regions. Economic development, however, requires a growth of good jobs, and in particular, we use measures of income and employment persistence as indicators of good jobs. And throughout the book, there were a number of regional characteristics that positively impacted the growth of regions, but not overall economic development. The next cross-cutting theme, and like the other two, this came up over and over and over throughout the book, is that some U.S. regions are growing and developing, and thus they are pulling away from the pack. This process of divergence is fueled largely by differences across regions in things like human capital, technology, and creative workers. And now we've come to the end of the road and the final principle. And hopefully, if you watch the other videos, you have a pretty good idea about the keys to economic development. And you might even think that you can take these keys and unlock a growth of good jobs in a region. It's as easy as that. But unfortunately, the final principle of economic development is that economic development is actually very difficult to achieve. Although many regions have experienced an impressive growth of good jobs over the past few decades, other places have encountered considerably more difficulty in their pursuit of economic development. What's more, there are places that actually rate quite high in terms of the factors that we found to support the growth of good jobs, but yet they are not doing particularly well.